Hi, I'm Chris Comeaux, and gosh, I wish I was doing this actually face-to-face with so many of you who have been influenced by Lee over the years. And who knows, maybe we'll actually have a Thayer reunion sometime in the future. I was thinking about not preparing for this because if Lee wanted us to do this, it's all about improvisation. So I have about 5 Lee stories that I want to share. And so the first one is actually when I met Lee. And so I was actually part of a Vistage group, and I remember hearing about this guy as one of the top Vistage speakers in the country. And we had and because Lee was so famous, we had a banker in my Vistage group, and it was kind of a high-performing bank. It was in a lot of different magazines, and the leader and all of his senior leadership team were kind of cocky. And we had permission to bring our senior leadership teams to this Vistage meeting because Lee was so famous. And I had never seen someone do what Lee did before. Quite often, this banker was very much in the knowing mode. And I saw Lee dismantle not only the CEO of this company, but all the senior leadership team with questions. And it was just so fascinating to me. And there's a great line in the movie Jerry Maguire that when he had me from hello, well, Lee told a cow story, which I'm not going to take all of your time because all of you have heard the cow story before. If you've not, we have to memorialize that some kind of way. But Lee had me from the cow story. And he told that story to the bankers, and I'll never forget them just scratching their head. And I just thought, I've never seen someone speak like him, ask questions, rattle people's cages in such a way. And I said, I've got to know this guy better. So I went up afterwards and got his number, and then I would take Lee to lunch once a month. And as always, you know, all he would do is ask me questions. I went to him for answers, and he would just ask me questions. So that's my first Lee story. My second Lee story is The Devil Wears Prada. I would hear him talk about this movie, and then finally together we launched the Thayer Institute, and I was part of the inaugural class, Carol Fisher, myself, Dr. John Morris. And of course, we use The Devil Wears Prada as actually one of the teaching tools. But as opposed to many of you now who have the wonderful tool that the Thayer Institute has, which is the whole Devil Wears Prada with Lee introducing it and the vignettes and the discussion questions, we didn't have it back in the day. So after a full day of Lee rattling our cages as CEOs, teaching us in the way that only Lee can teach, we actually had dinner, and then after it was dinner and a movie. And so I think we started like maybe about 8 p.m. And if you've ever watched the movie like The Devil Wears Prada with Lee, he just, okay, stop it right there. And literally, we probably could have gone till 3 o'clock in the morning. With first off, when I'm his age, if I am that with it and have that much energy, but he was just so passionate about learning. And so he did nothing but keep asking questions, and just all the learning around The Devil Wears Prada. And interestingly, as I reflect on the probably about 16 years that I knew Lee, I realized, if you guys know the punchline from The Devil Wears Prada, I was Andy. And if you know that one scene at the very end when Miranda gets in the car and she kind of smiles like, I made that person into the high performer, into someone who can actually live their cause and purpose. I feel in many respects I was kind of Andy in my time with Lee. My last couple stories are some of the stories that Lee used to tell about his granddad. One of the famous ones, actually, I just quoted the other day. And Lee talked about how his granddad, all of you probably remember his granddad, how Lee was sent during the Great Depression to the Forum, and about how he was standing next to his granddad, and his granddad took a 2x4 and hit the mule upside the head. And Lee said he was startled looking up at his granddad, and it's kind of like, what did you do that for? And his granddad said, son, sometimes you just got to get their attention. And I've used that quote and that story many times. Of course, we'd never hit an employee with a 2x4, but I think we all know the metaphor. The other story that I love about Lee's granddad was actually the story maybe some of you heard before about his granddad putting Lee up in the buckboard of the wagon with the 4 teams of horses. He said his granddad was a teamster, and that how he had put the reins between Lee's fingers, and he fixed it to where one of the horses out of the 4 was not pulling, and he said, take off. And then he stopped the horses and he asked Lee, he said, do you feel that? And he said, yes, sir. He said, 4 horses, that was 2 horsepower, 1 horse not pulling. Fix it to where all 4 horses are pulling, and said, take off, put the reins back between Lee's fingers again and said, take off, and said, son, do you feel that now? And Lee said, yes, sir. He said, 4 horses all working together, 8 horsepower. And I love that, and how Lee, he hated you to use the word teamwork, but he'd use that wonderful parable. Who knows if it was ever true or not, but it so illustrates what has become cliche, which is called actually teamwork. And then my last story, actually 2 stories. One is just a funny one. I don't know if there's a learning lesson, but Lee and I traveled together to St. John Fisher's College and to be part of, just work with the team there. And Lee was going to meet these students, part of an MBA class that Derek Vanderlee was actually using Lee's material. So Lee and I were traveling together, and Lee was up in years when we did this. And we were trying to get through the airport because we were actually going to almost miss our flight, our connecting flight. And we were traveling through Atlanta, and we barely made it into the actual subway train. And I should have probably just let us miss it. But I jumped in, and Lee kind of followed me, but we weren't able to grab the pole, and the subway train took off. And unfortunately, Lee fell on this lady that was like in a wheelchair afterwards. And I was just so horrified. I was so worried about if he was okay. And we got him stabilized, and he's standing up, and he had this wild look in his eye. And he looked at me, and I'm like, Lee, are you okay? And he goes, at least she was soft. I could still see that look in his face today. And just hilarious. He was so witty and so quick that was the first thing he said, is at least she was soft. And then the last story, this one is, and I tell this one because it tangentially shows how I think Lee is going to impact all of our lives, probably for the rest of our life. I got to be with John McBath and his leadership team, and he was taking them through leadership thinking, being, doing, and he invited a guy from Army War College to be a part with his leadership team. We were going to tour a Civil War battlefield, but it was all in the context of Lee's material. And I asked this guy a question that I was super proud of, because before meeting Lee, I never even would have had the wherewithal to ask this question. And to me, this really encapsulates a lot of what Lee taught me. And I asked this guy, Army War College, think about someone to teach at Army War College, the competency and the background. I had one question for him. I said, is it all about preparation or improvisation? And you know what his answer was to me. It's all about both. And that's what leadership is, preparation and improvisation. I will forever be impacted by Lee. I'm thankful for the time that I had him in my life, and I know all of you feel the same.